Welcome, everyone, to the Australian Bitcoin podcast. In this episode, you're listening to myself, Justin, and Daniel from Hardblock. And today, we're joined by RustyRussell from Blockstream to discuss Bitcoin and Lightning Network development. But before we start, a quick word from our sponsor. The Australian Bitcoin podcast is brought to you by hardblock.com.au. Hardblock is Australia's oldest Bitcoin-only exchange. They have no added fees and are optimized for dollar cost averaging. Sign up to Hardblock today using the discount link in the description below to receive free auto-send batch Bitcoin withdrawals for the next 6 months.
All right, Rusty, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
No worries. And Daniel, good to have you here too.
Yeah, likewise. Good to be here.
Perfect. And Rusty, you were mentioning just before that might be feeling a bit jet lagged, having been to the Lightning Summit just recently.
That's right. Just flew back in end of last week, so it's bright and early here. And fantastic 3 days in Oakland, technically, not in San Francisco. Although from this distance, it seems like the same thing, but apparently it's different. It's across the bridge.
It's only that much further on the map.
That's right. Yeah, it looks identical to me. So 3 days in Oakland at the Block offices, with hanging out with all the teams, pretty much in the dev teams in the Lightning space, and fantastic event.
Pretty big turnout of developers.
Yeah, so it's an invitation-only summit. So it's basically, people who are working on the core protocol and discussing changes there. So the last one we had was actually in Adelaide in 2018. So it's been a while, and it was great to get back together with everyone.
Great that it's organised here as well. Like, how did that one come about for it to be positioned here?
Oh, that was because of me. I said I'm gonna host it before it gets too big. So I'll do it early. So that was technically the second summit was Adelaide. First was in Milan in, I want to say, 2016. So it'd been a couple of years. So this is sort of the third or fourth one, depending on how you count it. And
is that a good amount of time to lead between them, like 2 to 3 to 4 years sometimes, to let development really take place from what came out of the last one, rather than sort of talking too much about things before they're gain traction, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, so we have 2 weekly spec meetings that are on IRC or on Jitsi. So we do kind of see each other, but actually getting everyone in the same room and a little bit broader too. Ecosystem is really helpful. And given how productive it was, I think that's a really good cadence.
That's great. Did anything come out of it that you found particularly exciting, or things that have already been worked on, whether it's sort of new or existing, that you thought would be worth mentioning? Yeah,
so there was a lot of stuff that we were working on that we kind of brought to a head. A few things got pushed further. There's a protocol for creating more privacy called the Oakland protocol. I think that name is sort of stuck.
Is that just because it was sort of originated there?
Because it was in Oakland, right?
Yeah,
an easy name. So the Oakland protocol, which basically involves trying to defend against people probing the network. So when people are generally probing the network for 2 reasons. One is because they're trying to figure out where capacity is so their payments can work. But also you can be probing the network in order to try to track payments. And it's the latter that we really want to sort of try to defend against, because obviously your payments are supposed to be private between you and the recipient, and if somebody can sort of track them, that's bad. So the Oakland protocol is our sort of first attempt to have a systemic way of making that process harder. And it's not perfect, but it is fairly simple. I expect most implementations to roll it out in the next release or so. And importantly, it gives researchers something to grab onto, because then they can look at it and go, okay, so how could this be improved? In what ways does it suck? How can we break it? And so we're really looking forward to that feedback. So the intention was to get something that gives us something, we think. It does definitely help. It's not perfect, but it's also simple. So we can roll it out, and then we can have people attack it and see where we go next.
That's really cool. I guess for anyone listening that's not sure why probing is important on the Lightning Network, because it helps with that efficiency of when you go to send a payment. You don't want to, every time you go to send a payment, it says, oh, we couldn't find a route, or there wasn't enough liquidity or capacity in that particular channel. So you want to be able to probe your route first to know that this is how much I'm paying, this is where it's going to be going, and then it gets sent. But then, of course, you're right. Like, the flip side of that is the vulnerability where someone trying to surveil the network can discover channels, can discover channel balances or other peers, that kind of thing. Is there a nice conceptual way to understand what's the difference? Like, how is that going to be, still enable probing for the utility of sending and knowing that it's going to, receive there, but at the same time, making that a bit more kind of obfuscated, so you don't give away too much detail.
So this was probably the hot topic at the summit, was this sort of privacy trade-off. So conceptually, you are probing because the network isn't reliable enough, basically. So making the bit more reliable and trying to figure out how much can you share that improves reliability without giving the game away. So if you tell everyone exactly your channel balance every time, then they can obviously see when a payment goes through because your channel balance goes down. So that's too much sharing. But giving them a clue as, hey, this is actually probably a pretty good option, is a nice middle ground. So there were several discussions on that. In fact, René Pickhardt, who is a researcher who's done a lot of really good work on payment reliability, in fact, is driving most of the implementations at the moment to change the way they route payments, particularly to optimize for reliability for this reason, has started diving into this question of, how does this affect the network? Assuming everyone's trying to do these optimal things, what does the network look like? What incentives are we creating for people? And is that good for the network as a whole? Which is something that I'm glad someone is thinking about, because it's really important. But these whole trade-offs of privacy, like how little can we share, and to make it work and help, because ideally, if payments just work, you don't end up probing, right? So you can get more aggressive on your anti-probing strategies because no one should need to do it. But at the moment, and you end up probing by default. I mean, just trying to make a payment, having it fail, and retrying, which is the standard Lightning Network way. I mean, Lightning Network payments, it's okay if they fail because you don't lose anything.
True.
So, you give it a few shots. I mean, it's faster if it succeeds the first time. But your wallet does this for you, right? It'll try a few things. And doing that is basically probing, right? It's going to find out some stuff. It's going to, well, I'm pretty sure there's no capacity there because it wouldn't pass my payment. And I'm pretty sure there is because that one did. So, yeah, it's tricky. How much are you going to share? This is one of the things that protocol designers, talk about for 3 days.
That's great, and good to see that is a priority as well. Anything else that came out of, particularly the Lightning Summit that you thought would be noteworthy to mention?
Wow, so we had a 2-day Core Lightning meeting beforehand, and then 3 days of Summit, and so it was incredibly intense. I came away with at least 11 major things that I've committed to doing. I don't quite know where I'm going to find time for that, but a number of those things were from the Summit. I think the Oakland protocol was probably the most concrete and achievable one. But there was a pile of different tweaks to protocols and improvements that we want to have, and things that we've discussed that are finally moving forward. So that's really good. But there's a lot of work across the protocol for all kinds of different people. So probably should step back actually and talk about how the spec process works. So there's a spec of like, here's how you should join the Lightning Network, right? Here's how your software should behave on the Lightning Network. And to make changes to that spec, you need to obviously make a proposal. Hey, we should change this, and here's how it should work. And then you need 2 different implementations. So you need to find another team to implement it, and you implement it, and then you test that it works. And that's really important because the second team will look at it and go, hold on, why did you do it this way? They'll tweak it, have all this feedback. But by the time 2 groups, 2 people have implemented it, 2 implementations are happy with it, it's pretty straightforward, and then it can get finalized in the spec and go, right, the gates are open for everyone to implement that if they want to. So so these things happen all the time, but it definitely, having people face to face, there's a bit of horse trading, right? You're like, I really want this feature, and I really want this feature. Well, you implement mine, I'll implement yours, and we'll do cross testing. In fact, there's a protocol which was technically finalized at the meeting itself, which was the zero-conf channels. So this idea that if you trust someone, you can they can open a channel with you, and you don't wait for the normal Bitcoin confirmations. You go, cool, I trust you. You're my LSP. You're already providing me with stuff, so I'm just going to assume that's going to work. And so we can use the channel before it's even hit the chain, and that's useful for some scenarios. But there was no standard for it. So the zero-conf standard was something that a number of teams kicked off. We completed interop testing at the summit. In fact, we had 3 different implementations, interop test, and we applied it, and then discovered we'd broken something, but we fixed that. So that was something that has been worked on for quite a while, and actually getting everyone face to face, be able to test directly, typing at each other was definitely sped up the whole process.
Absolutely. So it sounds like the overall vibe is kind of adversarial but collaborative. So you've like, even that when you mentioned you've got 2 teams, one team will work on the implementation, the other team looks at that and says, well, why'd you do it that way exactly? And then by the time you've got some consensus between those 2 teams, it starts getting rolled out. I'm sure there's still the adversarial thinking from that point, but it's nice that it's collaborative, but at the same time
competitive, maybe
competitive. Yeah, everyone's not just trying to rush it forward.
Yeah. A bit of competition is good.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
You're constantly weighing up that efficiency, that utility, but again, things like privacy. You don't want to sacrifice speed for security or privacy for convenience.
Absolutely. And there's been for me, it's been an honor working with such an incredibly talented group of people, and it certainly keeps me on my toes trying to keep up with everyone, because there will be different approaches, different thoughts, a lot of rejected ideas before we get to something that everyone is happy with, that we can, and having this level of expertise. I mean, these are the people building the network who understand it to a level that nobody else does, right? You've actually had to implement it and make it work in real life and all these things. Just the amount of knowledge in that room was really impressive.
On that note, I'm curious, what kind of people, which individuals and which companies were present at the Lightning Summit?
Oh, I don't have the list.
Have to name.
And we have
just like some of the.
So obviously Lightning Labs were represented, Core Lightning and Blockstream were represented. LDK, the Lightning Development Kit from Block, well represented. We had ACINQ representing, so Eclair and the Phoenix wallet. These groups are the main ones who've been most active in the spec. We had a couple of others. The VLS project, the Lightning Signer project, they were represented well. Breez wallet was there as there are a few wallet vendors. Anthony Towns sort of as an independent researcher, René Pickhardt as an independent researcher. So there was a lot of huge brains trust in the room, and people with different motivations. They were like, we've got to have this feature now. This is really important for our users. And other people are like, no, this one's really important for our users. So, but what's impressive is the engineers all have the same. We want the same things, right? Maybe we want them in different orders, right? This one's more important than that. But very little debate is about fundamentals. It's very little about, but I want to sacrifice privacy. It's like, no. Everyone's trying to maximize that. We know what we're doing, right? We want to maximize privacy. We want to maximize reliability, so we can discuss trade-offs. But everyone's pretty much wants the same thing out of the Lightning Network. They want it to work. They want it to grow. They want it to flourish and really become the transport that we can see it can become. And UX is important and all these other things come in, but as engineers we're all definitely aiming in the same direction.
That's really good to hear too, because I know that is a concern that can come up sometimes in the community as about Lightning, and especially in regards to Lightning privacy, where my understanding is by default it's naturally more private than on-chain because it's ephemeral in terms of transactions. But given that everything does link back to usually a 2 of 2 multisig on-chain, there is some level of traceability still there, and it's good to know that it's not done yet. I think because people in the community do sometimes feel that way, where it's like, Lightning's not private enough, so let's just keep doing mixing or something on chain. But knowing that privacy is remaining that priority at the same time as building in greater utility and convenience as well.
Absolutely.
That's really cool.
Yeah, privacy is key to everyone in the Lightning Network. And again, it's a work in progress, right? As you say, I mean, there's new attacks come out and you go, okay, well, now we need to defend against that. How do we do that? So it is definitely a moving target, and some Bitcoin improvements like Taproot makes it easier for us to make it clear or introduce uncertainty. All payments start to look the same. So whether it's opening a Lightning channel or making a normal payment, you can't tell anymore. That obviously just improves across the board.
Absolutely.
Something else I wanted to ask about the Lightning Summit is because there was some disagreements between you and the LND people, and I think you were going to go into that later, Justin, so we don't have to go into the details of that now, but I was just curious, was there any progress on that? Did you guys manage to make some headway in the disagreements, or not really?
We've all been working together for like over 6 years now, so we're pretty well established where people stand.
Okay,
and to some extent, it's a question of engineering priorities, right? So different teams have different priorities. The Core Lightning team have always been very spec focused. I mean, we are more concerned about the network existing. I mean, Blockstream got into this not because we needed a Lightning implementation directly, but because we wanted Lightning to exist and we wanted it to flourish. So my primary role, and I started the spec process, very much was that that we should have this common spec and anyone can implement it, and that's really important to us. for Lightning Labs, they've definitely gone aggressively after developers. Great documentation, great community. So they grabbed a huge amount of market share because that, for them, LND, this is a product, right? And they're building services on top of it. So that was an important thing to drive. So there's definitely different motivations there. Wallet authors are more concerned with like the front end and UX, not so much like the back end and how everything else worked. Core Lightning, for example, was the other way. It's like, well, we didn't really care about users so much for a while. That's changed this year, but we really wanted to be like a back-end server side. We had the ability to make payments, but it was more about, running your server, running your business on it, which is mainly about receiving payments, not so much about, your mobile stuff and things like that. And async, absolutely. They're all mobile. They're all like, how can we make the non-custodial mobile as seamless as possible and while getting as little information from the users? They've been very much driving that privacy. They don't want to know what payments you're making, right? So how, their question is how little can they know and still have a great mobile experience, which is completely non-custodial. They never hold your money, but they also don't want to hold your information. And so they've pushed a number of initiatives like trampolines, and they've been very active on onion routing and privacy because for exactly that reason. So there's different teams with different interests.
You're right. I guess like we're sort of directionally heading the same direction, but at the same time, there's going to be nuance, really, isn't it, in terms of those engineering imperatives or what feels to be the most higher priority. And there's always going to be a bit of, again, collaborative conflict in that to try to like iron out what is the best. Yeah,
absolutely. And let's be honest, we're better than LND, of course. Because
of course,
and different engineering decisions. Early on, like a couple of years ago, we had the Million Channels project where we simulated what if we take the network and we scale it up, make a made up network that it has 1 million channels in it, which at the time was like that was huge. Whereas now it's like, well, actually, we're like a factor of 10 away from that. So. But and it broke our implementation. Like it just fell into pieces, and so we had to rebuild it. We did a lot of work then on making ourselves really optimal. That's paid off now, so we can we don't have to worry so much. Other implementations didn't go through that stress test early on, and so now people are often finding that there's some issues as the network's growing, which it is. It's growing every day. It looks like we're going to have within the next couple of years, it's going to have to be like a 10 million channels project.
Yeah,
because a million's just not going to cut it anymore. We're going to be there.
That feels like a very good problem to have when you hit that point of really trying to hash out the scalability of everything and to make it stable at that level.
It is, but there's so many other things we'd love to be doing as well. You're kind of like, well, but I've got to work on privacy. And this is the difference, right? Different teams like, well, this is critical for our user base. That goes to the top of the pile. Yeah. So, and there's so many different teams now that I think, it's part of the fun. Like everyone looked at all the stuff and went, wow, there's a lot to do here.
I was going to just say that we can use that clip where Rusty says
C Lightning's the best, or Core
to get the LND people to come on
that's true
with us.
That'd be a good carrot, a good motivator. Yeah, I like it. Good point.
So we often give give each other a bit of grief over different things. There's some things that they've done really well, and they're definitely pushing ahead with like Taproot stuff. So Roast Beef has been very active deep diving in Taproot, exactly figuring out how that will work. And I'm delighted that he's doing that because that means that I can ignore it until he wrote a draft spec which he literally published 10 minutes before the beginning of the meeting. I suspect he may have pulled an all-nighter to get that version out. So there was some really great discussion on that. That's going to be great. We're going to have a second team implement it, and then that'll go straight in the spec. So that's looking really promising. And it's that's a priority for them. They're like, yes, we want Taproot. We want it in. Let's make that happen. And so that's good. I'm like, great. They will do a fantastic job. I'm hoping one of the other teams will do the second implementation review it. But then we'll be chasing tail lights. I'm like, crap, we've got to get this, right? Everyone's going to want it all of a sudden. But we have dual funding. We have splicing in draft. Someone has an example of that. So in other ways, we're ahead on certain features. They're ahead on certain features. And it makes you sweat. They come out with something new and you're like, oh, damn, we really want that. And you look down your list of priorities and you go, oh, okay, what do we bump?
Yeah.
Right. So,
this is the great thing about competition, really, isn't it? It keeps that motivation constantly there. And once you hit a milestone, you celebrate briefly, but then you need to keep moving on to the next one.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely an engineering mindset, right? The engineering mindset is very much like you focus on the problems. Yeah. And that can be a trap. Like people ask me questions about Bitcoin, and my natural go-to as an engineer is, well, here are the 3 problems with it. But you do have to, stop and smell the roses sometimes and go, but look how far we've come.
True.
Right. I got a fantastic email from Bastien of ACINQ, who was sitting in El Salvador, and they were having beers, and they'd paid for it with Lightning, and he went, I'd obviously made some comment previously about, sometimes as engineers we've got to look back at how far we've come and celebrate our wins. And so he sent me this photo of them having beers, which they'd paid for with Lightning, and he goes, "Yeah, okay, it is a little bit surreal that we talk about all the things we've got to do still, but
some of this just works.
It just already works. And there are people really using it, and it's making a difference, and that's fantastic."
That might actually be a very good segue for anyone who's listening who isn't aware of sort of your journey with Bitcoin. Could you maybe give a brief background to like what got you into Bitcoin and perhaps even specifically Lightning development? Because it's that motivator, that origin that can sometimes make it more salient when you reach those points of a milestone or something to celebrate.
Absolutely. So I've been an open source developer for over 20 years. So basically got paid to give away my code for free, which when I first started doing it I didn't think it would last more than 6 months. Someone contracted me to write some code that was basically taking a project I'd done before and just doing the next version. And I convinced them if they sent me a paycheck, then I'd be able to do it full time, and it would only take half the time. Of course, it took twice the time because of software, but the principle was there. And surprisingly, that happened ever since. So that was in the late 90s. And then I had 20 years of hacking on Linux, the Linux kernel full time. And I really enjoyed that, and that's been my career, basically doing open source software. When Bitcoin came around, I read the white paper, and that was my introduction to Bitcoin. I thought this is kind of cool, and I grabbed I bought like $100 a coin, so because to get some to play with, and I spent most of them. I got goxed, I tried to sell some in Mount Gox, and my wife, I got married. My wife went, half of those are mine. I'm like, well, I've spent most of my half, so it's not a problem. This is it's just like a few $1,000 now. I could push this to Mount Gox, sell it, and anyway. So so those coins are long gone. Hey, you never know. They may come back in some sense.
That's right.
But so I toyed around with it, but never really done much with it. It was just another fascinating open source project to me, and that was always my direction. And then my wife encouraged me to do a sabbatical. This is in sort of 2015, because I had this idea. Scalability was a real problem. I was like, can we create like what would now be called a sidechain, where you basically move your Bitcoin across to there, and it wouldn't perhaps be as secure as Bitcoin, but it would make some trade-offs to make it fast. So you'd have sort of this petty cash system. And I called it petty coin, and and if you accumulate enough there, you'd move back to Bitcoin where it was safer. So this was the idea. I spent 6 months on a sabbatical doing that, just messing around. And right at the end of that, Blockstream dropped their sidechains paper. And I was like, well, that's what I've been trying to build for the last 6 months. It would have been nice if you'd done that first. So I started talking to them, and I went across to join them as a Bitcoin developer. I was like, hey, I'm going to switch from Linux kernel developer, which I've been doing for the last 20 years. I'm going to work on Bitcoins. It's going to be awesome. And while I was talking to them, the Lightning paper dropped. And Taj Dryja and Joseph Poon had written this paper about how we could do this Lightning network thing, but they had no intention of actually implementing it. They just written the paper, and they're like, well, And Greg Maxwell, the legendary CTO of Blockstream, turned around to me and said, somebody needs to write this. I think it's going to be you. And it was a bit of bait and switch, because but I was going to work on Bitcoin Core with these other, these other people. It's going to be amazing with the other devs. I was going to be the new kid getting coffee and trying to learn my way around. I'd been, brushing up on my C++ skills, and I was all ready to go. But this was too exciting an opportunity. So I had read the paper several times to try to understand it. And finally, when I did, I'd written a series of blog posts, which was basically, here's how you read the paper, because there was a lot of novel stuff in there, and it was really, really hard going. And so I ended up writing the first Lightning implementation. And we came together in Milan with what Taj and Joseph did actually form a company, which was Lightning Labs, which they have since left. But they were there, and so were ACINQ, looking at, everyone had parts of an implementation. We had actually used ours in anger, and we basically went in and we had this big meeting on what it should look like. Now we had some idea of what we were doing, and then we all went away and rewrote all our stuff to meet the spec. So that was how I got into Lightning. And yeah.
Did you, when you first got into like free open source software development, like Linux in particular, have in mind what this might become, like a distributed system, or distributed systems generally speaking, that have like freedom to use and modify and that are open source? Like now it seems kind of obvious to me that it's very difficult to fight an open source distributed, decentralized system, one that is truly those things. But I wonder, like, back in the 90s, was it obvious, or was it just, you knew this was the right thing to do, and if this thing gets legs, that'll be great, but if not, we just got to work on it anyway.
And so in university, so like kind of 94, this kind of time frame, I was exposed to. I was using Emacs. I was exposed to the whole GNU experiment and this idea of like that there was a moral imperative behind software. And I'm not sure that I completely absorbed it, but there was, it was certainly an appealing idea. And in my first job, I was hacking on various things, including G++, the GNU C++ compiler, and I was interacting around the world, the early internet, with people who are way smarter than me. Like, there's amazing, amazing authors who are just, I could work with them for free. And in a small kind of backwater like Adelaide, technological backwater, I'd kind of reached a certain level of my direct peers, but then being able to reach out, and there was a whole nother level up here. And for me, that technical excitement was what really drove it. But it was only 97 where I really kind of understood what we were doing, because I went to a conference called Usenix, which was the big Unix conference, and they'd decided that they should invite some of these Linux hippies to come and talk about what they were doing. And I went to several talks, but I particularly went to one by David Miller, who was taking Linux and porting it to the UltraSpark, which was, Sun. This was Sun's own hardware against Solaris, their own version of Unix. That was the version of Unix. Like this, and I went into that room, and I knew how software was written. Right, serious software was written by real corporations, and they had all these protocols, and they hired really smart engineers, and they put them in a room, and they did all these things, and out came the software that you could use. And that was just the reality of how software was made. A bunch of students over the internet throwing something together that's not how it's done, right? That wasn't a tenable model for anything. Like it was amazing they got anything to work at all, and that was really cute, but it was never going to be, it's hard to describe now how outlandish the idea that they would produce something. But David Miller went through this talk, and he compared Linux, as he ported it, against Solaris on their own hardware, on Sun's own hardware. And by the end of the talk, he'd beaten them on every single micro benchmark. And I came out of that and I went, holy crap.
There's something here.
This actually is, these people can win. Like, they've actually produced something that is it really threw me. I mean, I knew that it existed, but to realize that it could compete, that realized that this was a real way of producing software, was, something that I think that thought kind of formed in me. But, and also the fact that I was like, this is what I want to work on. I want to work with these people. These are the people I want to work with. But the idea that it was serious, like, my goal perhaps had been, hey, I could work for some big software company doing amazing stuff. I could work for, maybe one day I would work for Sun, was kind of probably thinking, that was the kind of my thinking. It changed. It's like, no, I want to work with the best engineers in the world, and they're not at Sun. They're here, and these are the people I want to work with. And that just radically shifted the direction of my career. And within 12 months, I had that contract to work on some of the stuff that I've been hacking on in Linux. And it just went from there. People kept paying me. It's
great to hear. And it just, it feels like it's now the next revolution in terms of software is free open source development. And I feel like companies that are even having the closed source ethos are starting to shift a bit more to open source more of their framework. And you definitely see it in the Bitcoin space. I know that's like a criteria that I often have when I'm looking at, do I try this new wallet? Do I run this new type of node? Do I look at this new piece of hardware? It's a matter of like, well, how much can I find out about it? Who's developed it? And if I don't have the answers to those questions, I move on to another project. And I know more and more people are doing exactly that too, which is a great thing. I don't think that's totally prolific outside of Bitcoin just yet, but it feels like that's definitely gotten traction, especially with things like Linux systems becoming now one of the most widely used operating system on servers, especially. It feels like this is just this shift psychologically and morally in the way that people look at things like software, which is just very cool.
Absolutely. And this is something that the world is different from the way it was 20 years ago. So think about what happened the last time somebody created a revolutionary new digital, electronic cash, peer-to-peer cash system. That was DigiCash. And the answer was you patent it, you try to release it as a product and do all those things. And that was just that, to be fair, that was, in the 90s, that was still the way you made software, because that was how the world worked. The world's different now. Nobody would have, Satoshi, of course, released everything open source, but he built on a huge basis of that's how you build software now. If you want software that everyone uses, you release it to the world. And that was a radical, out there idea 20 years ago, But now it's part of the fabric that we live in. And so I have been through this revolution. I have been through, talking to people, old timers who are like, well, that's not how it's done. That's not how the world works. And there are definite echoes here in the Bitcoin world. We're like, that's not how you make a currency. Yeah. It's absolutely the same arguments. Like that's not how it works. And fair enough. That is definitely true. That's generally how that is not how currencies have been made for quite a while. But it is the same greybeards, Unix greybeards. Like, well, that's not how you write software, you kids. I see the same thing, and even among my Linux colleagues, many of whom think that I've kind of lost the plot switching to Bitcoin. I'm like, no, it's the same thing. We've just we saw the world change here, and I'm just delighted that I get 2 chances to do this in one lifetime. That's pretty unusual.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. What are some of the things at the moment that you're working on, say in regards to Lightning specifically, that you find, kind of keep that motivation going?
Oh, wow. So much stuff. We, at the beginning of the year, we kind of pivoted and said, okay, so we should really get Core Lightning, C Lightning as it was known then. We should really get more users. And there's several reasons for that. One is that we were pushing some spec initiatives, and if some of them are, like dual funding. So both sides, rather than one side open to the Lightning channel, you can both cooperate to open it, which has some great privacy properties and has some really nice other properties about, you can then start selling liquidity and all these other things. But of course, both sides have to support it. So if you've only got like a handful of the network, that's not very useful. It's more useful if you've got more. And the other thing, of course, that happened is that we had a bit of a, there was some tension with Lightning Labs. They have been building proprietary centralized products on top of the Lightning Network, which is fine. I have no problems with that. But I do feel that they've taken their foot off the pedal as far as, pushing the spec process and pushing standards. So, kind of LND is the dominant one on the network, and they're like, well, they're pretty happy with that, right? As long as that stays true, they're not going to do the work to kind of to catch up with other things, and particularly things that aren't people aren't screaming for. So things that are important to me on the spec side. All right, well, then the answer is simple. Get more of the network. Implement these things, put some pressure on them, and either they won't implement them and people go, well, okay, we're going to run Core Lightning because that has the features that I want and it has this spec process behind it, and we like that standard stuff. Or more likely, they hit a certain threshold and they crap, we're going to have to put some more engineering resources in. I mean, to be fair, it is very hard to make money as a startup in doing open source infrastructure. Like it's a hard problem. So naturally, they're going to pick and choose where they put their resources. And this is the same argument that we've had, we talked about before, where different teams are going to have different priorities. And so the way for me to have an influence on Lightning Labs list is to take users away from them. Not so much take users away, though. What's actually happening is that the network's growing so fast that what you do need to do is get more of the new people who are coming on board.
Yes.
So we did several things. We rebranded to Core Lightning. I mean, it sounds dumb, but if you Google C Lightning, it's actually really hard to Google. So Core Lightning is easy to, it's easier for search results. So, so picking up the phone that had been ringing for 6 years from marketing was one of them. That was kind of step one. Secondly, a third of my time is now, my time tends to split between Core Lightning development and the spec development process. And I have now split into 3. And so a third Core Lightning, a third spec, and a third, like, what do users want? And sometimes it's, they want a macOS binary of the latest release they can just download and run. They don't have to build it themselves. I have no idea about building macOS binaries, but it's definitely on my to-do list to get that. And users say, oh, this was awkward to use, or documentation here was bad, stuff like that. Just those little things that make it harder for people to use, putting more resources into just making sure that experience for them is better. So even just hanging out in our Telegram and Discord to make sure that you get that nice turnaround. People ask a question and you can give them an answer pretty quickly. So we're also taking on a new sort of web developer, and she is giving me an awful lot of homework about things to improve in the APIs that she doesn't like. And she's like, oh, why do you do it this way? Why do you do it this way? This sucks. So a lot of my work is on stuff like that. So there's definitely been a refocus on, okay, let's make this stuff more approachable, rather than just as kind of we want to be a really good implementation of the spec and we want to kind of follow that really well and have the spec drive us. We're like, okay, we should also start reaching out for users. And I think that's good. Engagement. Yeah, more community engagement, more of that stuff. Now, We've also seen the rise of the Lightning Development Kit, so LDK, which is Block, which used to be Square, Crypto, whatever their name is this week. But yeah, they basically have sort of this Rust-based sort of set of parts that you can build Lightning into your product, whatever it is. So they really want to produce this thing, and they're starting to see some usage as well, and they are very, very. Matt Corallo leads the team there, really, from a technical perspective, and he is very pro-spec, and he's been driving a lot of things. So it's good to see them come in and shake things up as well, because for a while it was sort of the three choices, and now we have a big fourth one. So, and I'm hoping that there'll be others out there as well.
Yeah. I just because some of this stuff is interesting to me, especially because we at Hardblock we are looking to implement Lightning payments and withdrawals by the end of the year. So I've been looking more into that and had some discussions with you and about the difference between because we had to make the choice: are we going to use Core Lightning or LND or whatever else? And I think one thing that came up is definitely LND seems to have the best documentation. It's very approachable, and it seems like they do focus a lot on that kind of user experience, and obviously they do a good job on that. But they have quite a high market share. I think it's like around 90%.
Yeah.
So I think one thing is it's actually good to have a bit more diversity within the actual implementations. So the kind of the ecosystem isn't all reliant on LND. But what I wanted to ask you is, so for somebody like us, like an exchange looking to choose which implementation to use on the back end, and maybe you could just kind of spruik Core Lightning. Like, what do you think are the advantages of Core Lightning over the other implementations?
Okay, I mean, to beware that it's a moving target, of course, right?
Yeah.
So if you just come in and everything else.
Yeah.
So from my point of view, Core Lightning's APIs are really second to none, and we are very much we're extremely efficient. So our database is pretty small, makes it easy to back up, stuff like that. So we also go pretty much like for the high end if you want to do things like we support PostgreSQL as a back end. We have for like 3 years now or something. So then PostgreSQL is a database that allows you to do replication and all those other things that you might want. So it's one thing if you're running it on your Raspberry Pi, that's great as well. But if you're running in a data center and you want to make sure that you've got redundancy and backups and all those things, that's absolutely kind of like that's our core ground, right? That should all be there. So that's, I guess, a big area for us. And we try to split. So we have experimental options and non-experimental options. So we try to delve, like the core is absolutely solid and everything else. There's that we don't break. We've had nodes that have been continuously upgraded since 0.6.0, which is our first, which was the first spec compliant after the Milan meeting. That was the first spec compliant version. And so it was an incompatible break with 0.5.2, which worked, but used a completely different protocol. So we switched, and we've had people who've upgraded continuously through that process. It has not always been flawless, but the assertion is, and certainly are, modulo bugs, you can just upgrade and you just roll into the new upgrades. And that's important to us, right? That upgradability is incredibly important. So I treat this software as this is mission critical software. This is server class software. It shouldn't, it shouldn't flake around. On the other side, there's a plethora of plugins that people have written and that you can write. In fact, as you get to more advanced usage, you often find yourself wanting to write some boutique plugin, and they have an amazing amount of control over the network, and they can do, a lot of really, really useful things. And so increasingly our core functionality has actually been split out into our own plugins. So it ships with some, and there are more out there that people write, and they're pretty straightforward to do. So people often write plugins for boutique business logic that they might have to add commands and add other things. So that's important. And of course, that also means you bring the crazy, right? There's a lot of stuff in plugins that is amazing experimental stuff that you do not want to touch in production, but wow, it's cool. So and absolutely, particularly to things like trying out new spec proposals, right? Because nothing's finalized until it's finalized. So we implement them, you try them, we put them behind an experimental option, and go use that with the understanding that, hey, it might break tomorrow if the spec changes because it's still in flux. So we do try to do that, but really the idea that we should be producing software that just is bulletproof and just runs is our core competence, and that's where we feel we have the most to offer.
That makes a lot of sense. And as a user who's just recently set up a Lightning node, although I will admit it was an LND Lightning node, and that was probably more to do with the fact that I think if they had more of that approach to the users or the community at first, it kind of becomes organic. People start writing guides. So when I go to look for, all right, I want to link a Lightning node with my Fulcrum server that I've linked to my Bitcoin core, which one I'm going to choose, and Lightning LND is like the main one that comes up. So that's what I've gone with. But
absolutely.
I can see that being very useful for users in terms of like the stability, but the ability to experiment without breaking things. And of course, if you're kind of gaining that feedback back from the community, that's probably going to get their engagement to start producing some of this kind of material that makes it easier to implement for everyone else as well. It becomes this nice kind of snowball effect in a really great way.
Actually, yeah, we've definitely seen uptake in docs and doc fixes and stuff like that, just from the increasing engagement that we've done in the last few months. So there's been a lot more people helping on that. The other thing is, of course, Blockstream have actually announced a product using Core Lightning called Greenlight, and the idea is that we host everything, but you hold your keys.
Yep.
So it's non-custodial. You end up signing off on everything on your end, and you hold that, and you can migrate off later as well, because that's really important to us. But we can also take over the hosting, and we can do all the the mechanics for you as well. And that's really interesting for us because it lets us dog food our own stuff. So while all the Lightning Core team members run their own nodes, this potentially will be quite a different scale. Lots of nodes, lots of users, lots of really great feedback on any kind of issues that come up. We will have that information. So that I think is going to accelerate that flywheel where you get really good feedback, and you can incorporate that in future releases. So I'm looking forward to what that does.
I also just want to add, as part of my research, I did read some comments of people who went with LND because it was the documentation, it was easier to get started, but they seem to actually wanted to change to Core Lightning because I think it's more modular and more customizable, and but they had some kind of there was some kind of cost to switching, but yeah, there did seem to be some people who kind of want to change because of that modular.
We've definitely had some users who've experienced both, and really, and they're good because they give us pros and cons. They go, okay, I really hate that you don't have this feature that LND has, for example, and sometimes like, great, let's do that. Sometimes they're like, well, that doesn't really work for us because we think that's a bad idea or whatever else. But generally, it's like, okay, cool, yeah, we'll put that on the list, right? If that's the thing that's stopping you, we should move. The cost of shifting is really interesting though, and that is important. So people have often said, oh, why don't you create something that basically takes an LND node and basically turns it into Core Lightning and migrates it. I'm like, well, there are engineering reasons why that's always really hard, right? And then the new version comes out, and oh crap, you've got to debug all that and all this thing. But more, I'm not interested in it. I'm not interested in converting existing LND users. I mean, I'm interested if they want to try a new node and everything else, but I'm more interested about the growing pie. Cool, new users, what do they want? Let's make it easier for them. Let's jump on board with that. There's this kind of zero sum. Trying to subtract away. Now, there's a caveat there that if Lightning Labs ever, they're a startup, it happens. If they ever go broke or something terrible happens, and it definitely won't happen soon because they just got another round, which is fantastic. So they've definitely got funding. But you always worry about using code from a startup. What happens if that becomes abandonware? And at that point, it's like, okay, we'll probably put some effort into helping people migrate and things like that. But that's a very distant scenario. Short of that, I don't really see it happening. But increasingly, we get a lot more people who've run both, and they're great because they can actually give you a really good comparison, kind of around this and I like this and around this and I like that. I think that's really useful. Whereas asking the devs of each, they haven't necessarily experienced the other one as much, and so just other than their own obviously internal biases, I prefer Core Lightning because I wrote it. Kind of that's yes. I don't think I can give a fair comparison in some ways. So it'll be interesting to see those users come forward and hear what they have to say.
Yeah, very true. If someone was interested in getting involved in it in some way to just run their own, to experiment, to provide some feedback, where would you suggest that they go? And I can include it in perhaps the show notes. And if you don't know off the top of your head, you can always let me know.
Yeah. Look, we'll link their best sites in the show notes. But most of the development happens on GitHub, and it's pretty approachable. There's lots of different places that you can reach in and grab stuff. So we tend to make we aim for like 2 to 3 months per release. So it tends to work along at a pretty good clip. Next release candidate should be about a month from when we're recording this now. But that's because our last one was extended because we had some real features that we want, but usually it's time-based. So we aim for that fairly tight release schedule, and of course, try not to break anything in the meantime.
That's it. That's great. I'm keen to check it out. I'm always happy to experiment with that sort of stuff. I feel like I'm a bit late in starting to dabble in Lightning Network because I kind of went down the rabbit hole of on-chain privacy and coin joining and everything else, and it's taken up a lot of time. But now I've gotten to the point where I can just see so much more utility with Lightning Network. I can see the adoption really kind of going exponential. And it's just another interesting thing to start to dabble in as well. So I'll get involved as much as I can.
Yeah,
I am curious about Greenlight. So is that sort of pitched at institutions that want to run Lightning, or is that just for general users as well?
Yeah, so out the gate, we've basically partnered with a couple of institutions, so basically LSPs, who are going to encourage their users to use that, and that's just easier for us because it's easier to onboard one group than it is to open it up to the public. But definitely, the aim is the roadmap is that there'll be more individual users using this and spinning up like a free Lightning node. It's great for just spin up a Lightning node, interact with it, and then you're done. So it's just an incredibly convenient way to create a node, which I think is useful for people experimenting as well.
Absolutely. I guess my tangent is always around privacy. And so with that, I guess there would be some trade-offs because you're going for the convenience. It's a non-custodial, as in you keep your own keys, but it's custodial in the sense of data, perhaps. Or is there some ways that privacy can still be worked into that?
This is, of course, the eternal war. And it's really important to understand that if you run Greenlight, then we will see the payments that you are sending. Mm-hmm. In particular, because you'll ask our node, so how do I get to Joe? Well, obviously, I think I know why you're doing that,
yes,
right?
That's right.
And we will see payments you've received, but we won't see invoices. So we can tell that funds have come in, but obviously we can't tell what it's for. Yeah. So there is a level there. We've talked about Oblivious Send, where rather than you telling us, hey, make this payment, please, you'll tell us, send this onion. Like, so other than the fact that we know a payment is going out, we have no idea where it's going, which obviously requires more work in that, rather than just holding the keys, you now also need to be able to learn something about the network and do routing and things like that. That's why the trampoline proposal, which is out of the ACINQ team, for exactly this reason, that currently they're in a model where, the primitive one was you had to ask, your phone had to ask and route this. And then, the problem is that people open their app on their phone because they want to make a payment now. And the first thing your phone does is, hold on, I've got to find out what's in the network so I can decide where everything goes. It's like too late. They've scanned the QR code by now and they're trying to make a payment and you don't have the up-to-date information. So there's a number of things around that. And one of them is this idea of trampolines. You can basically outsource and go, cool. You tell someone else, okay, I know how to get to them and they will get it the rest of the way. Whereas at the moment, by default, Lightning works as you make all the decisions on exactly the path it's going to go, and you send off your payment or split into parts. But this idea of trampolines is basically you can tell them, cool, and you probably tip them a little bit as well for this because the way Lightning works is you pay for routing, and so you go, cool, get this to here, and that could be another trampoline node again that pays the final. In that case, all they know is that they may guess where it came from with the other Lightning node, but they don't know. Nobody knows both the sender and the receiver.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Which is definitely a win.
Because at the moment, for people listening that might not be aware of some of the, the issues but potential solutions with Lightning privacy is, my understanding is like sender-side privacy, if you're running your own node, assuming that is very good because of the Tor routing framework or protocol. So it's hard to know where the payment has come from, essentially, if you're receiving it. So if you're sending it, you've got some protection there. However, if you're receiving, you presenting a QR code with your address essentially on it links you to the UTXO, perhaps, that underpins your channel. It says your IP address of your node, your alias of your node, all of that detail. And so there's I think a few proposals. So trampoline routing would be one of them, which you've just described. And now I think another one was like rendezvous routing, which is similar to like blinded routing, which kind of adds in some like fake hops in there, or even some like unnecessary hops, which makes it a bit confusing of like, where is this payment actually going to end up? Therefore, the receiver gets a bit of that that privacy as well.
So rendezvous got abandoned. So there's a couple of things. There's three things on this. One is the ZeroConf proposal, which I talked about, that we finalized. That also includes this ability to have node to have short channel ID aliases, which is practically very important if you are that invoice case where you show an invoice. Now it has a fake node ID. It has a fake short channel ID and potentially a fake node ID. So yes, they know the last hop, like before you, but in a lot of cases, if you're a mobile wallet, for example, there could be thousands of mobile wallets hanging off this, and they won't know which one. So that is just a very simple thing to not reveal your on-chain footprint when you pay, and it's something we've wanted for a while. So it's great that finally got finalized. And that's rolled to the implementations now, and you'll start to see that. So that's one easy tick box. Trampolines, as we mentioned before, but there's another thing, and that we never went for vendor privacy. So this idea, the person making the payment, their privacy is protected by the Lightning Network. But we punted on the idea of what if you want to offer services and still be anonymous. And there are kind of ways to do it. For that final hop, you can do some things. You can do a few things at the moment, but it's not really native in the protocol. And so part of the work that we had to do for BOLT12 and all those things was this idea of blinded paths. So I can present you with a path, but you can't tell what that path is, and I can have dummy things in there. So again, you can't really. It looks like it's a five long path, but it could actually be 3 and 2 dummies or something else.
Yeah, that's right.
So cool. So you get it to here, give them this blinded path, put this in, and they can do the rest. And even they don't know, other than the fact they know that they have to unwrap it twice and they pull this path out, but they don't know anything either. So that potentially gives you a lot more privacy and opens this door to kind of vendor privacy. Now, vendor privacy isn't so critical for most use cases, but in particular for, you owe me $5 for pizza. Really, you just want to get the money to me, right? You don't really care where I am on the network. And I don't really want to dox myself as like, I'm this major node on the network, right? That's just because I'm trying to take some cash for you. So there are valid cases, but the particular case where this is important is the refund flow. Another thing that we punted on is in BOLT11, there's no refund flow. So you pay me and then I go, oh, crap, actually I can't deliver it because we're out of stock or whatever. I want to get the money back to you. And that's a very manual process at the moment, something that BOLT12 addresses with a formal flow. But even if I contact you and and I go, sorry, I can't get it, you now have to present me with an invoice. But remember, we said sender privacy was important. You were supposed to pay me without me telling you. Well, now, do you want to dox yourself? Because you're going to need to do that to get your money back.
And the default would be go set up a separate node that you receive on, which is what I would do. But that is a completely inconvenient thing for most users to do, to have a separate sending node, now a separate receiving node, which you just have temporarily, then you get rid of. And
that has to have liquidity and everything else. By definition, the first one probably has liquidity because you made the payment out. So the payment can go back in quite conveniently. So yeah, it's not practical. And yeah, it presents a real problem. This refund flow is actually critical to, we talk about real commerce and when you really get down to it. So that's something that BOLT12 addresses, and I think is really important.
It's probably a good segue actually into BOLT12. So BOLT12 is an improvement upon BOLT11, but I'm not completely familiar with what is in both of them. Is there a way to maybe sum up some of the main issues with BOLT11? Because it's your proposal of BOLT12, isn't it?
Yeah, I wrote BOLT11 as well. So
BOLT11, well, I mean, that it probably feels nicer. It's like less adversarial in that way. But yeah, could you give a bit of just a summary on like what is BOLT11 and therefore why is BOLT12 building upon those things to modify them? Okay,
so the reason they're called bolts, by the way, is that our specifications are called bolts. Basis of Lightning technology. We all love our Lightning puns. So the bolt process is the spec. So they're numbered. BOLT11 was is the spec that basically talks about how to encode an invoice. So when you see a QR code, that's a BOLT11 QR code almost always. And that says, okay, so you got to pay to this node. You've got to pay this amount. Here's the pre-image that you're going to get the secret for. So that's how you know you'll get paid. When that's done, and optionally, here's some other details like here's a description, here's a couple of route hints to help you get to my node and things like that. So that's all in a BOLT11 QR code. But the problem with BOLT11 has a number of problems. The encoding is kind of janky. It was not extensible, and there's a few other things, technical things that we don't like about it. But importantly, that isn't. I mean, it does the minimum amount that we need. We need to convey that information so you can get a payment through, and that's what it's for. But people make mistakes, and that is, for example, you should produce an invoice for every person separately, and you should never share them. Once someone has paid an invoice, it's dangerous for someone else to try to pay the same invoice again, because an invoice literally is a contract for you will give me you will give me this secret in return for this money. And that's literally what's happening on the Lightning Network. Everyone's swapping for these secrets. But once the secret's out, the secret's out. And so if you try to reuse it again, any node in the middle that happens to have seen the original payment can take your money. And so, it's not what people expect. And you can't just print out, you can't print out the the invoice on like on your website or anything else. You've really got to serve it every time, and that makes for a painful payment flow. You've got to generate them, or what so you have to have a click through because you don't want to generate it every time someone hits the page and stuff like that. So there's a number of problems with BOLT12, both both just practically, but also conceptually. People don't expect things to work that way. They expect to basically post it once and they can get multiple payments from it. So BOLT12 basically adds a layer on top. Yes, there's a BOLT11. Sorry, there's a BOLT12 extensible invoice encoding, which uses a lot more modern things and everything else. But you don't generally see that. What you see is something we call an offer, and an offer is like a BOLT11 invoice. It says, here's the description of what you're paying for. Here's where to send the money and everything else. But that's not the real invoice. You use the BOLT12 offer to basically go, cool, I want to take this offer, and then you get the real invoice. And that's the invoice you pay. Now, your wallet does all this for you. It basically is cool. I've found it. I've got the real invoice, and I pay the invoice. But this opens up a world of possibilities and things that we couldn't do before. So, in particular, it opens up this idea of recurrence is the obvious thing that people wanted. So, people really want, the Patreon in the box model, where they have, cool, here, pay me $5 a month. Okay, now, so that means your wallet has to be more sophisticated, and wallet authors are going to, have fun trying to implement this because it's a much bigger demand. They have to keep track of what recurring payments are you doing, when are you doing them, what if they pay, what. But the other thing that comes in, I just said $5 a month. That's a much more realistic than 5,000 sats a month or whatever you're going to charge, right? It's going to be in some fiat currency. So then you're going to have to do conversion and everything else in your wallet. Now your wallet probably does that for you already because we're not all post hyper Bitcoinization, and people will convert. But in recurrence is particularly important because recurrence is almost always in the vendor's currency. So then there's questions of authority, right? So you've got this thing saying $5 a month, and you say it says $5 US a month, and so you approve $7.50 or $8 or whatever it is today, Australian dollars a month, right? And what it does is it goes and fetches the invoice and gets it back, and that invoice really is in sats because that's what we're dealing with. And at that point, it converts. It goes, hold on. No, you approved $7.50 and they've asked for $8. Okay, at this point, I have to go back to the user and go, that monthly bill that you said to pay? Seems like they're, maybe the currencies have fluctuated. Maybe, maybe it really is still $5 USD. It's just, Australian dollars sucked or whatever. But, there's a whole heap of options around this. So, but once you open this door to recurrence, I think that's incredibly powerful. Now, with that said, we ended up excising that from the very first version of the spec because wallet authors looked at that and they went, wow, that's a big pill to swallow. Yeah. That's a lot to do. Now, that is something that I consider to be that I want my wallet, my Bitcoin wallet, to be my agent in the world. I want it to do all this stuff. I want that tab of all my recurring payments. And vendors love recurring payments. And they love them for two reasons. One is you don't have to get to remind someone every month to send another payment, obviously. But the second reason they love them is that they're really sticky in the credit card world because it's so hard to reverse them, which is terrible. This gives you exactly one of those, which is it gives that recurrence and everything else. But I can tell my wallet to stop paying anytime. I do not have to fill out forms. There is no pull on the Lightning Network. So people absolutely want this. Users want it. Vendors want it. It's a fantastic idea. But I want that control. I want to be able to look through and go, hold on, why am I leaking sats? Oh, that's right. I said I wanted to pay them every day. I'm going to, okay, that one's gone. Done. That level of control, I think, is incredibly important. And I'm looking forward to wallets stepping up and doing that. But similar with refund flow. So one of the things that you do when you ask the invoice, you go, oh, but here's a key, right? So I can prove that I was the one who requested the invoice, which is fantastic because if you need to refund me, I send you an invoice, prove that I'm the one who held that key. So I'm definitely the one who paid for it. And I can prove that I've paid for it. You know that I paid for it. And I use a blinded route in there just so you can't even tell where you're sending it to. And you just send me my money. Thank you very much. And that's all implemented in Core Lightning already. And we're seeing LDK and Eclair are both actively implementing this at the moment, are going through all the steps. And of course, this means that the BOLT12 format is still undecided until it's in the spec and finalized, and everyone's, they're making changes. They're going and going, no, I don't like this. I don't like this. Okay, we'll change it. So in the last 4 Core Lightning releases, I think every time we have broken, we do both. Okay, now we're going to support the pre-spec one and the new spec, the new hotness, and try to do both. It's been a lot of engineering challenges to try to do that, and then we kind of throw it away. So on the BOLT12 website, it makes it very clear that don't get the tattoo of the BOLT12 QR code just yet, because that's going to be embarrassing until the spec's finalized. But once the spec is finalized, then go for it, because it'll definitely have some legs then. So
it's exciting. That sounds like it's really addressing quite a lot of I guess just things that are happening in reality, like you say, refund flow, sort of subscription-based payments, which I think so many things are a subscription-based payment nowadays, which is convenient for both the user and the vendor. But then, of course, you need to have that easy enough way to be able to control it, but also have it be able to go through the Lightning Network in the first place and not reuse addresses in a kind of a privacy negatively impacting way.
So people are using LNURL, which is another spec for doing this at the moment, and it basically is a web request, and you get the real invoice that way. And that's so that people use that as a static address. The problem is, of course, you've got to be running a web server, and the web server has to support HTTPS and everything else. And I really think the future is you just run a Lightning node, and you don't need you don't need to have a web server which requires a certain amount of dynamism and things, and you certainly don't need to have a web request which leaks my IP address, tells you who I am, and before I pay you. So I think that is actually going to be really, really important. And so this is like a full native a Lightning native experience. And LNURL is great, and it was certainly easy to build, right? You build it a separate layer on top, but I do think that this is the experience that I think we all want, and that everyone should be aiming for. And yeah, it requires more engineering, and it's taken longer. But we're going to see both in the wild for quite a while. But this is definitely the Lightning future that I want to see.
Yeah, it sounds very, very cool. I've got maybe like a two-part question related to it. So, how long's a piece of string might be the answer to the first one, which is, what do you think in terms of the traction for BOLT12 to seeing that, agreed in terms of consensus and implemented? And also in that, am I right in thinking that you might have some ideas around just the overall process of implementing Bolt changes? And so I guess, how far is BOLT12 away? And also, are there any improvements on that meta process of bolts in the first place that you might be able to comment on?
So the first question of how far away is it? Like, we had to get an implementation out. So Core Lightning supports it, and the Spark Wallet front end, which is a front end to Core Lightning, supports offers, which is really, really nice. Someone sent me an offer, and I scanned it, and I just said, oh, cool, I'll send you some sats. No. The offer was to send me sats, because you can have an offer that's an offer out, basically. Send you. So that's the ATM case, right, where it gives you QR code, whatever. I was like, oh, actually, they're trying to give me money. Okay, cool. Hit OK, and it just worked. And that was that moment of like, whoa, that was pretty cool. So that's really good. But, the Spark front end is a bit of a niche. That there's a lot more popular front ends, and there's also major wallets, like, of course, Phoenix from ACINQ. So once we see the wallets start to roll it out, then I think it really, we can really get, there's two things that happen. One is that we get a whole heap of feedback of the things that we want to extend it, like we've kind of done the minimal version. There's all these things that we want to do. What's the highest priority, and what are we going to get? And that comes from user feedback, that experience. I mean, BOLT12 was built on the feedback we got from BOLT11, but once people have got it, what are they going to do with it? That's going to be fascinating to see how it goes. So I expect that we will start this flywheel as we see more wallets implement it. Then we'll see more pressure for other wallets to implement it, and I think it will actually happen pretty fast, because the Lightning Network itself tends to upgrade pretty fast. We're still in that early days where people tend to, a new version comes out and everyone wants to upgrade and stuff like that. So things can actually roll out pretty quickly. As far as the spec process goes, one thing, the spec can be pretty intimidating, and I think it's called a specification, so people are really kind of intimidated by it. And I think that's one of the things that I'm going to be doing increasingly is outreach to people. If you have a spec proposal, I will help you kind of navigate the process and everything else. It's usually not that hard, and there's more people who understand now how these things work, because there's been a lot more attention on it recently. But you can pretty much, get a bolt number and propose it. I mean, you should probably go to the mailing list first and discuss and see if it's even, if it's feasible. But it's certainly not that difficult. And there's a process called a blip process, which is much more like, we will just publish stuff that you've come up with, which is a lot looser. Some of it is just more things optional things, but really you want to aim for the whole bolt formal process. If it's something you want everyone to implement, you think this is something everyone should do, then you have to kind of go through that process. And yeah, it's laborious simply because you've got to propose it, you've got to find two implementers, they've got to implement it, they've got to check it, everyone's got to be happy with it. And yeah, that's that's longer than just, hey, I've implemented it, throw it over the wall. So I think some people can find that a bit intimidating, a bit frustrating, but I also think that's incredibly important if you want this to last, which we do.
True. And again, it's without a leader or an authority that you can go to say, help us make this decision, or tell us exactly the meat grinder we should push everything through to get to the sausage at the end. It is more of an organic process, reaching consensus without a leader, essentially.
Absolutely.
Is it drastically different from the usual BIP process, just for Bitcoin Core? Because it sort of sounds like it's somewhat the same, but maybe there's not that final almost consensus saying, yes, we are definitely going to implement this. Now it's just a matter of when and how do we signal it. Sounds like it is a bit more organic, where the changes will just start being made and other people kind of jump on board if it's usable, and feedback process becomes like constantly organic throughout the whole thing. Yeah,
so we have some advantages. So both processes are loosely based on the internet RFC process, which is the old school, it goes sort of back to the 80s of how internet standards are developed. So pretty well established there. The request for comment, IETF standards. And so both of them are kind of modeled on that. In our case, in the BIP's case, you're not supposed to edit the BIP once it's finalized, so that stays. Whereas ours are more living documents, and we do actually revise them.
Gotcha.
The reason we can do that is because Bitcoin never gets to discard anything. Once it's in Bitcoin, it's got to stay there forever. With Lightning, we can be a bit more fast and loose. If you and the node that you're talking to both agree on something, that's it. That's fine. So we can actually, there are things that have been removed from the spec, in fact, that we supported, everyone upgraded to the new version, and then we dropped the old ones. And no user ever noticed. And that gives us a lot more flexibility. We also, for the similar reasons, have multiple implementations doing it. So, so the coordination problem is a bit different than trying to get a change into Bitcoin Core, for example. So it is a bit more loose in some ways, but it's also more spec driven. So a lot of the stuff in Bitcoin there is Bitcoin Core. Whatever Bitcoin Core does is the standard, and changes are pretty well documented, but the existing stuff isn't. Whereas we don't always hit it, but we aim for the fact that you should be able to basically start with the specs and write. That's how LDK wrote. They read the specs and they wrote it. It's never quite that simple, but that was certainly the aim. Everything should be there. Everything should be spec that you have to do, and that you should be able to work from there.
Is there any talk in the Lightning community about trying to iron out a different process, or the way that you described it sounds clear enough to me, but like I want to say a clearer process where there's just a clear methodology, because I know that's come up in the op CTV or covenants or BIP 119 debate of saying, like, do we just need a clearer process of how this happens, and then we will avoid this confusion in future, which I personally think that's probably not what we need. It's actually good to have it a bit confusing and to reach social consensus in a messy way. But are there people in the Lightning community that are saying, actually, let's make it more streamlined, or let's make it more clear what these steps are and follow the bouncing ball?
There's been a little bit of people who didn't know and trying to educate people. So no, there is a process. This does exist and everything else. There's also been the blip process, which has opened up for more. If you just want to do some advisory thing, or you're in the experimental space and you want to do something more experimental, here's a place you can put your documentation on how that stuff works, which I think is useful. So that has definitely broadened things out a bit. But mainly we look at the BIP process and all those things that you've just referred to and go, oh, thank goodness we're not trying to do that, because that's a much more anarchic kind of consensus gaining thing. Whereas you can implement a new thing, and if both nodes implement it, that's great, and if other nodes don't implement it, that's great too. So we have a lot more flexibility at that level.
Is there ever an issue of interoperability with that kind of that way of developing? Is there a point now where some of these things just will never actually speak together in terms of, say, like Core Lightning and LND, or is there always like a base layer of interoperability where the Lightning network overall will continue to function?
No, we always aim for interoperability and everything else, and in practice, you end up the core stuff is always implemented by everyone, and if there's any interop bugs, then we have great bug reports across each other. And if we think it's a security thing, there's like a whole heap of private back channels. Oh crap, I think I found a bug, and I think every implementation has found bugs in other implementations at various points. So there's a lot of work on that. You have a user who goes, I've got this, and and my channel isn't working with this node, and you look at that and you go, oh, okay, it's an LND Core Lightning thing, and you go through logs, and we both we all jump on it and we try to figure out what's going on, and that happens, not all the time, but it definitely happens, and interoperability is obviously a key for everyone on the network that we should that should work together. So it's more the extensions and the more the optional stuff. Now some of that optional stuff becomes de facto, everyone implements it, and then we can go, cool. If it's replaced something else, that gives us an opportunity at some point to go, okay, everyone, you've got 6 months before we're going to take the old stuff out. Different implementations go at their different speed, right? One implementation go, no, I'm going to be aggressive and stop talking to anyone who doesn't support the new stuff, and and other implementations could be more conservative.
I guess the difference between Bitcoin and Lightning is Bitcoin absolutely needs consensus. And with Lightning, there's a bit of room to actually do your own thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, kind of experimenting on Lightning. But again, if you reach that base level of interoperability where nothing's going to be broken as such, and it's more like optional extras that can be either rollback or modified, yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I was curious to talk about another thing related to Lightning privacy that you've suggested as well, and it was to do with the way that public channels in Lightning at the moment need to announce their existence, essentially to say, hey, look, I've got Bitcoin in capacity, so you can route through me if you need. And at the moment, the way that that is announced is it gives away quite a lot of information. It actually says, essentially, here is the UTXO to prove that I have that Lightning channel capacity. But then, of course, anyone who knows a little bit about on-chain, say, chain analysis or heuristics, becomes very easy to monitor that public node and perhaps even the other nodes that are going to connect to it over time. And so my understanding is you've proposed like a different alternative to that, where public nodes can still say, hey, here I am, I have Bitcoin, so you can route through me, but they don't need to disclose what is their UTXO that's associated with it, or perhaps even like exactly the amount of Bitcoin that they have, because by, of course, giving that away, it becomes a bit more easy to find it on chain as well. Could you talk maybe a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came up with the original gossip method that we use today, which is basically, you know, it's very simple. If I have a channel with you and I have to prove that it exists, and I have to prove that I have control over it. So I say, here it is in the blockchain. You can see it's unspent. It is of this amount, and here's the signatures. You know, I've used the signatures that could spend the Bitcoin. I've used them to make this announcement. So therefore, I control, or we control this output. And that's a really clever hack in many ways. It avoids you being able to spam the network. You've literally got to have the Bitcoin to do it. The downside, of course, is chain analysis. And even if my node is completely public, your node may not be. And just because this activity is public doesn't mean that future activity is public. And I don't necessarily, I am, and also to some extent is if I'm revealing all this information, I am subtracting away from the anonymity set of everyone else. So if half the network announces, it becomes a lot easier to de-anonymize the other half. So it's an antisocial thing to do across the board. So mea culpa. So we have to make a change to support Taproot because it uses a different format. So when I said we prove that we control the UTXO, that's very much nailed to the way funding transactions work today in Lightning. We're going to change those with Taproot. So we've got to choose something there. So throughout the thought experiment, okay, do we go for a whole gossip V2, this completely different system where we don't rely on advertising, just saying literally proving that this is my channel, and use a different method? And the proposal was that you actually say, hey, I'm a node. I'm going to prove that I control some Bitcoin because we want that for anti-spam. And I'll similar kind of proof to what we have now, except that if I prove that I control, say 100,000 sats, that will let me then announce channels up to say 1 million sats. So, and the other thing is that those proofs that I do control those would be something that you wouldn't be able to tell it was me. I could trade with someone else. Go, hey, I'll sign for you if you sign for me. And you go, great, not a problem. So, some trust involved there because, they may not sign for you and you've signed for them and everything else. But it does give you an avenue to obfuscate that. So someone controls this Bitcoin. There are definitely some Bitcoin on the network. So you haven't just completely made it up.
Could you, sorry to cut in there, but could you even in time, could that be extrapolated out to having some sort of like blind coordinator type role where two people don't necessarily agree to swap those proofs? It's actually a group of 10 people all agreeing to swap proofs in a way that maybe can't be, or maybe not 10, maybe 100, maybe 1,000. Is that like...
You can definitely get more sophisticated with your approach to how you would do this. And you could, well, there's two things. One is you could sell the liquidity. You go, cool, I've got these coins in cold storage. But if you want to use them for advertising your Lightning channels, I'll make some sats on that. And the risk there, assuming you design it correctly, is very, very low. You do need to refresh these things every so often, but you can do it in such a way that you basically take your things to sign a delegation key, and then you use that key. That is the bit that you actually sign every month for the other people. So potentially it's a way that you make some sats on cold storage, and so there are interesting reasons that you'd want to be in this marketplace. Or you could just swap with your neighbors. You just, hey, whatever, if you got one, I've got one. Let's just mix this up a bit, and we'll swap. So definitely things that but it's a kind of a bigger project, right? So you still want to prove. We think that the best way of anti-spam is to still prove that you are holding some Bitcoin. Now, we've made it a little bit looser here. You don't prove you're holding all the Bitcoin. You don't necessarily prove that you're holding it in Lightning channels, but at least you put some limit on how much I can spam, right? If I want to spam out a lot of channels, I'm going to need a lot of Bitcoin. So it is an interesting approach. I went into the meeting. The one thing that I wanted from the meeting is this the way we want to go, or do we want to do the minimal approach that makes the minimal thing that makes Taproot work? Right? What's the smallest change we can do that, and talk about this as a separate step, or do we want to go for it all at once? The answer was the latter, the former. That we looked at everything that was on our plates, and all the implementers were like, no. We cannot, we would literally be biting off more than we can chew. We've got all these other things. We want to do Taproot. We want to do all these other things as well. So it is still on the table. It's something that everyone's very interested in, but it is a 2023 kind of thing. It's not a 2024. It is not a this year thing, to be honest. So that was a good decision to make. We came to consensus. Everyone was pretty happy with that. Well, Matt Corallo particularly was like, he wants it sooner. And I'm like, Matt's young and enthusiastic. I think that's part of it. The rest of us just looking at this huge pile and going, is there something we can defer? And that was it. But I do think it's important, and I do think it's going to be increasingly important. I mean, we're making other, as we improve privacy in other ways, the ones that we don't improve become, obviously the low-hanging fruit. And this, I feel, is one that when we look at this next year, is going to be, that's the one we've definitely got to fix.
Creeping in closer. Yeah, it does make a lot of sense in terms of for public channels being able to maintain a little bit more privacy for themselves, but especially for anyone that's linking in with those public channels. But then, of course, you're right. It's that whole process of elimination effect. If someone wanted to surveil the entire network and say there's 20,000 Lightning nodes, but 12,000 of them are publicly announced, you can immediately just say, well, let's just look at all the other 2 of 2 multi-sig on-chain transactions and remove the 12,000 that we know, and we've got left this 8,000. These are probably all private channels and private nodes somewhere that we can now start to brute force public key.
So people do that today. You can tell how many private channels are on there pretty much, because there are two of 2s. They're pretty clear. They stand out as paid witness script hashes. So we can do these stats. So obviously Taproot removes that. So when we've got Taproot everywhere, now everything just looks like a spend. And obviously if a channel breaks, something goes wrong, you have to go on chain. That's going to be a pretty clear footprint. But if not, if it just opens and you close normally, or we splice in, particularly when we talk about splicing and multi-fund, it gets a lot harder for you to trace through those things. And so once we've got all that protection, you go, cool, now let's look back at our gossip and see if we can remove that leak as well. So I do think that there was definitely some logic in going, cool, that is going to be the next thing. But doing it today, probably not as important.
That makes sense. So look, we've got about 30 minutes left in terms of time. I was curious to ask you a bit about the block header overflow kind of bug or issue as a bit of trivia for people that might not be aware of that. Having said that, has any of the conversation that we've just had brought up some a burning issue for you in regards to Lightning, or something that you think that we probably should have talked about that we haven't, or something along those lines that we can perhaps cap off the Lightning discussion with?
No, I think we've covered a whole heap of things. There's always more to talk about in Lightning, like Bitcoin, as I'm sure everyone listening would know. There's always more to say, but I think we did do a good summary of different things that are hot at the moment. So yeah, I'm happy to go to the block header bug if we want to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be great. I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of it. I was actually really impressed to see, because we went to the Bitcoin Bush Bash just recently in what was it? Beechworth. And the fact that when that was brought up, I believe 90% of people in the room put their hand up to say, I'm aware of this.
Wow.
That's great, because when I heard about that, which was only about 6 months ago, that was a brand new thing to me. And I thought that I knew all the kind of attack vectors or the potential issues, or we'll never have a hard fork again. And then once you learn about it, you go like, oh, we probably will. We'll probably have to. And that's a good thing, actually. But yeah, could you, I guess for anyone listening that might not be aware of it, maybe explain what is the block header overflow bug, and if you've thought about it, what could be some potential solutions?
So Bitcoin has these block headers. It's 80 to 80 bytes long, and then you've got the whole block that's committed to from that. But the block headers are kind of this minimal thing, and that's really what the proof of work happens on. The block header has to hash to this, statistically incredibly unlikely number. So okay, so that's how it works. And in the block header is a timestamp, right? So what time this block was made, and there are rules about time has to always go statistically has to go forward and things like this. But it is a number of seconds since 1970, and it's 32 bits. Now this is a very standard time representation, particularly in the Unix world. It's often called Unix time for that reason. And 31 bits overflows in, I think, 2038. It's called the 2038 bug, and it's a well-known problem. But we have 32 bits, so we have kind of another bit. That means that we don't hit the problem until I think 2140 or thereabouts. But at that point, Maybe it's sooner than that. Maybe 2140 when the block subsidy runs out. Anyway,
2140 when the blocks. I think it's a little bit earlier than 2140, but to be honest, it's when we're probably all of us in this room are dead. So
sometime when I'm very dead, there will be this problem, and that is that it will actually overflow. It'll go back to 0, and then blocks. The current software will break. It literally
it's like a Y2K
can't
kind of
work.
Deal,
it's very much a Y2K problem. So the answer's pretty straightforward. You basically take into account the wrap, and you, instead of treating it as the absolute number, you treat it as the difference since the last number, and that will always, even if it overflows, it works. So the maths is pretty straight. We know exactly how to fix it. That is straightforward. But nobody has. And that means the software running today will not sync the chain in 100+ years. So we will need to change that interpretation at some point. As you can understand, there's no huge urgency, but technically it is a hard fork because it means that old software will no longer read the chain, and that is something that we have avoided studiously, pretty much, and increasingly studiously throughout Bitcoin's history. It doesn't mean that there would never be a hard fork. It just means because you're abandoning old software, you absolutely need to have we couldn't do a hard fork in Bitcoin unless it was an emergency fork, something we have to fix. We couldn't, I feel, do one in less than 5 to 10 years. If we wanted to make a change like that, we need to get consensus, agree on it, make the change, get ready, and wait. Every piece of software everywhere has to be upgraded. Like this is like the Y2K problem, right? Because anyone who's not will fork off the Bitcoin network for the rest of it. So I simply don't think, and that process is going to be longer. The longer Bitcoin's been around, the longer that process will take, because it'll be in everywhere. It'll be almost, remember that vending machine that we haven't updated that was running Bitcoin Core, whatever, right? That has to be up to, all these things.
Well, adoption becomes like a bit of a problem in that way, doesn't it? Like the more nodes you have, the more that need to be updated, which need to be aware of the issue in the first place. And
I think my rule of thumb is that if you take Bitcoin's life so far and you basically go, we're going to take about 50% of that to execute a hard fork. So
just to clarify that, so if we were to make that change and somebody would not implement it, would the actual fork be at the moment we do it, or would we still stay on the chain until
they'll stay on the chain until 21 whatever, and then they'll fork off.
So it'd be okay. So that makes it easier.
Absolutely. I mean, it is the gentlest possible hard fork. It has the two categories. One is it's incredibly important, right? Like your nodes will just stop working. You can't produce blocks, like because it'll go, no, I need one greater than this number. It's like, well, there is nothing greater than that number. It's like, right, the network will stop. So obviously needs fixing. And the second thing is there's absolutely no hurry. So, we can go call it. We can give 100 years notice that if you're running 100-year-old software, you'll break at this point. I don't think that's going to be a problem. So, this one is a no-brainer. We are going to have to fix it, and we will fix it, and there's no urgency. So that's absolutely something we'll do. But any other hard fork proposal has to go through this. I think that there has to be a hugely, for any change in Bitcoin, there has to be a huge consensus that it's important. And there are a number of people who are like, well, actually, let's never break old software. Let's not open the door to anything that would break old software. And that's kind of annoying because in Bitcoin you can't ever remove anything because if something that was if you had some weirdness, you've got to basically carry that forward forever because there are old nodes out there who consider things to be the truth, and that's the way things are done. That's one of the reasons that Bitcoin moves so slowly. I mean, from one point of view, from another point of view, it moves incredibly quickly. But just from a consensus point of view, it's like no. You're making changes that you're going to have to live with forever. If you add a new thing to Bitcoin, we can't remove it afterwards. That has to stay, and so that makes the stakes incredibly high for any changes.
Is there a limitation on how many changes can be made? Like in terms of the OP codes or the NOP codes, is there like a certain or more can be implemented in the fullness of time if need be?
Yeah, so if we get into the weeds with the scripting language, there are a number of obvious places to extend, but also we added a whole new kind of scripting language with Taproot, and that also with SegWit actually, and that allows us to do Taproot. And that, while the script is very similar, it actually is slightly different. So we could add a new version and we could have a whole new set of rules. So at this stage, we're pretty much an infinite number of extensions. But the problem, the fact you have to support all the extensions forever is the main limiting factor.
Yes, that makes sense. And you don't want to be too quick to make a decision. Is it possible, this is more of the, I guess, the cultural or psychological or even conspiratorial hat on, is it possible when talking about doing a hard fork for something like the block header overflow bug, that will then maybe open up some discussion at that point? Like, is there any concerns about this, I guess, that'll open up the discussion at that point to say, all right, well, while we're doing a hard fork, should we reconsider 21 million cap, or should we?
Yeah.
I don't think people would stomach that now, but 40, 50, 100 years time or something like that. Is there any fears in the community? Like, once we open up this conversation, it's going to open up a lot of other tangent conversations maybe that we don't want to be having at that point about hard forks.
Okay, so yes and no. There has been talk about like a clean up hard fork that just gets rid of some stuff that we don't like, that we can't get rid of without a hard fork, that would simplify things that basically no one relies on at the moment, but it would be good to get rid of. There's an out by one bug in check multi-SQL. Actually, we're getting rid of that by getting rid of check multi-SQL. Yeah,
that's right. And it's like, if it's got the one at the beginning, you kind of know it's something.
Yeah. There's some stuff. There's some stuff that'd be nice to clean up. There's a time warp bug where you can basically play with timestamps in headers because the requirements are not quite strict enough and things like this. But so there's been a proposal. We do a clean up hard fork. I think at the moment, when we see other communities doing hard forks and it basically turns into rule by developer, I think there's a lot of skepticism for this approach at all. The requirement for a hard fork would be incredibly high, and I don't know that anything could meet that bar. That said, I've long been an advocate that we should do a block size hard fork, that we should look at increasing block size, but over the kind of range where it's not going to happen for 10 years. It would take a while. Everyone would need to get consensus on what this means, because you can decrease block size with a soft fork, but you can only increase it with a hard fork.
Yep.
So we could do it in such a way that we soft fork it down. So actually, cool, it could do this, but actually the rules at the moment don't let you. But then every year we renew it or something like that. There are a whole heap of proposals that we could pile on there. The question of, does talking about a hard fork open up the thing for people to do evil? It's important to remember that you can do evil with a soft fork, right? So a soft fork can confiscate your coins by making them unspendable. It can do so hard fork is bad, soft fork is good is actually way too simplistic. Yeah. So people are already talking about soft forks, so they're already going to be able to do dumb stuff. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a consensus system, and if everybody else decides to go that way and you're left by yourself, then I'm sorry. So if somebody convinces the vast majority of people to do something, but when you think about it, that's not a protocol problem. That's a problem. That's a societal problem. And it's also a fundamental problem of any kind of money. If everyone convinces the rest of the world that gold is worthless, it doesn't matter that you and your three friends still consider gold incredibly valuable. It doesn't help you.
That's the consensus now.
There is fundamental. It's just a question of degree. So in the Bitcoin world, how much of the economic majority would have to go the wrong way for you to be messed up is possibly lower than in a gold scenario, but there's a sort of potentially comparable numbers. Right? So to some extent, that is always true of the system. But if enough people get together and do really dumb stuff, but in a broader sense, if enough people get together and do dumb stuff in society, it doesn't matter that you've still got your Bitcoin because you're dead.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, I have previously suggested that a civil war is coming in Bitcoin at some point. We have there are like three eras of Bitcoin blog post I did several years back that talks about, the first stage it wasn't really money. It was kind of just still like this freebie internet thing and like experimentation stage. We're in this second stage now where it's kind of monetizing, and but it's still heavily subsidized. The majority of mining is paid for by the block subsidy, which is basically the printing of more sats on every block. As that fades, we enter into the third phase, which is basically Bitcoin self-sustaining, Bitcoin paying for itself. And there's a shift there, right? So at the moment, basically, your Bitcoin usage is being subsidized, and the third stage, you've got to pay for it. And that obviously causes winners and losers. So I suspect that there will be a group of people who are losers in the last phase, who've built businesses in the second phase, the same way we saw people who built businesses in the first phase when it was like, there was no dust rule. Satoshi dice being the classic one. You just spam the chain, no one cared. As that became priced out, and even before that, the developers, when they tried to pull those things, it was kind of this whole, it drove them bankrupt, right? They're gone. Now, to be fair, you could look ahead and go, this is coming, right? You build this thing, it's going to be transient, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people are capable of amazing amounts of delusion. If you build a business relying on the fact that there's a block subsidy and you don't have to pay for your Bitcoin transactions because they're being subsidized by the printing of new money, that is going to run out. But, you build a successful business, and then when it comes to run out, you try to change the rules. That's completely normal. There will be businesses there going, wow, some bean counter at blockchain.com or whatever will go, hey, do you know how many millions it's costing us to pay miners to mine our transactions? If only there was a way of getting someone else to pay for it. Of course.
Yeah.
And I expect them to absolutely give it a shot. And you end up with this war of people who are like the hodlers, who are like, no. And frankly, this is a the one thing that a lot of people, I'd say the vast majority of people who know anything about Bitcoin know about the 21 million limit. And that this is a core value that and personally, I feel it's not negotiable. Back when Bitcoin was being designed, we can argue over whether it should have been a hard limit or whatever, but this is part of the deal, and it's very clear at a bait and switch if we ever try to change that. So just on principle, I don't think it's negotiable at all. But, it doesn't mean somebody won't try, and there will be a lot of resources thrown at them because it's worth a lot of money to them.
Yeah.
And the miners absolutely would be split. The miners generally will be like, free money, absolutely. That's absolutely something we want. So you can see someone going that way. Well, on the other hand, miners are also big Bitcoin investors. So
True.
It's not entirely clear that all the miners will go one way. There may well be a civil war among miners at this point, because some of them are like, no, if I have to choose Bitcoin or mining, who chooses Bitcoin, who chooses mining?
Yeah.
But the other thing is that we had the block size wars. We've kind of had these debates. Now, there's a lot more people coming into the space who aren't familiar with those, but this is kind of one of the bedrock assumptions of Bitcoin, is that this 21 million. And so just on principle, I think at this point, but who knows, in 40 years time, 50 years time, we could be having very different discussions. They could be, oh, no, they didn't know then what we know now kind of thing. Or, Satoshi wasn't an economist. I mean, there'll be all kinds of arguments made for why inflation is good. And I don't think they're relevant. I mean, even if they were absolutely right, it doesn't matter, because I don't think we can change it, because that would be unfair. The same way that we can't do a soft fork that would make Satoshi's coins unspendable. Yeah. I think it's morally indefensible.
That's it.
Yeah. I just want to say in general about hard forks, like my personal feeling, I mean, a lot of people are afraid of hard forks, and I think there might be a civil war and a hard fork, a giant split at some point in the future. But like, I kind of feel, the way I feel about it, I recall the name of the movie, Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Love the Bomb, whatever the name was. I kind of feel the same way about hard forks. Yeah. And like with the block size hard fork, it was actually good for the split, because I feel like instead of having this kind of conflict, there was a split, and the market decides. Yeah. And it's kind of like an evolution of the strongest, I feel. So, people choose which side of the fork they want to support, and the market kind of decides in then who's right. And I feel that's in the future, maybe that will happen, and maybe there will be like some kind of disagreement. But personally, I feel like I'm okay with it. Like there'll be a disagreement, and maybe there will be a fork, and we'll see in the end which side of that fork becomes stronger.
In psychology, there's a concept which it'll sound strange, but it's very much accurate, that relationships are just a constant cycle of rupture and repair. And as long as you repair, you're actually building a relationship. Once you rupture and don't repair the relationship, you go your separate ways. But essentially, you could probably look at a lot of things on that basis of a constant, or another way in social psychology, it's called like storm and then reform. So every time there's a storm, you kind of figure out a new pecking order or a new priority. Everyone kind of forms together, and then actually things are pretty solid and reliable for quite a while until the next storm. And I think that's going to keep happening, because it's a very organic thing that happens in human relationships, even in one-on-one, but especially the larger the group gets, the more likely that is going to be. And you kind of need to clear that out sometimes. People that aren't in line with where the consensus is need to then kind of do their own thing. But it's the storm or the rupture or the hard fork which causes that to happen. And the other thing with psychology is that, unfortunately, the more time goes on, the more we do tend to forget the past. And then so like 40, 50 years time, it might seem unfathomable now that would happen, but in 40, 50 years time, a civil war, maybe even less than 40, 50 years time, to be totally honest. The talk of things like, maybe we should have a trailer mission similar to Monero, that way the miners can stay incentivized, or maybe we should have some other way of doing inflation. Maybe we had that wrong in the first place. Maybe money printing's not bad, it's just how much you do. And all of a sudden that slippery slope kind of concept starts working its way back in. So I kind of agree with both of you that this is quite likely to happen to some degree at some point because of human psychology, but it's also a very healthy thing that happens too, because this is how you clear out the dead weight, or the people pulling you the opposite direction, or the over leveraged, or whatever it might be. Like, this is free market kind of deciding again, which is the whole ethos of the consensus mechanism of Bitcoin. So
in particular, like to make it concrete, that the developers understood the nature of the block size parameter in a way that wasn't well understood throughout the broader community prior to the block size wars. There was, we understood, and I certainly understood, that the requirement for there to be some limit was important, because otherwise no one's going to pay for mining. Once the protocol was established, the future of Bitcoin was already written, and we knew that there was going to be a competition for block space going on. And it was going to be painful. It was going to be expensive. You're going to have to pay for it with your sats. The developers understood this very well. A lot of the broader community had not absorbed this. Fees were cheap. The idea that fees would ever go up was like, well, that's a bad thing. It's like, hold on, this was always going to happen. And so this knowledge had not diffused very well at all through the community, particularly because, in a hype-driven community, good news spells really fast and bad news is suppressed. And it's like, well, this may be bad news for you, but I'm sorry, this is how the system works. And so for developers, it was obvious. To discover that the rest of the ecosystem didn't understand and were shocked by this and wanted to fix this. And it's like, well, actually, sorry, this is how the system is built. And those decisions have already been made. And that's what it actually is. So part of it is understanding what Bitcoin actually is. And that information permeating. So your talk about like this kind of rupture repair, making it stronger, is like, yeah, actually this brings attention to what Bitcoin is. And to be honest, that's something we are still learning, because Bitcoin is a system that interacts with the rest of the world and is defined very much by how it interacts. And that is something that is very hard to predict in advance. And you could argue, well, Bitcoin is the same, and I would argue that Bitcoin is the same since Satoshi released it. There has been no significant changes to Bitcoin. There have been some cosmetic improvements and things like that, but fundamentally, it does the same thing that it did when it started. And what's changed is the world and the way the world treats it and the way and the people's understanding of it. But Bitcoin's the same as it was in 2009.
I guess this is probably a good segue into it. Two questions that I like to finish off on are what you see as the biggest threats to Bitcoin or threat, and what you're most bullish about in Bitcoin. Could what we've just been talking about be perhaps the biggest threat to Bitcoin, or is there anything else that's on your mind at the moment that you think we should be more cautious with?
I think privacy is the biggest kind of, and lack of privacy is potentially the biggest Bitcoin problem that we see. I think those technologies are improving not as fast as I would like. We've seen massive improvements in security technology. Hardware wallets are now the default, and they're pretty good. And there's a whole pile of work that's been done on that. A lot of driving of real infrastructure that's been created for that, which is fantastic. On the privacy side, we're seeing it, but it's lagging. It's definitely lagging quite a way behind, as you know, if you've dived into mixes and everything else. And so that, I feel, is still somewhat of our Achilles heel. The ability to analyze the network by nefarious actors, however you define them, is I think, possibly a systemic threat at some point, where you're like, okay, well, there's enough of it that you can no longer have privacy because there isn't enough privacy for you to be private in, because so much of it has been compromised. So that potentially is, I think that's probably one of the biggest risks. I actually don't use the term bullish, because bullish is like, it's very much a price.
It's very price thing.
It's a price thing.
I mean it more kind of.
I know, and it's become a phrase, but I'm trying to avoid it, because that's kind of the least interesting. The fact that it has a price at all makes it useful, and everything else is kind of is noise. Now, maybe if I was a Bitcoin whale and I had enough Bitcoin that I cared, that would be different. But but the thing that makes me most excited about Bitcoin, the thing that gets me up in the morning and makes me get to those 5:30 a.m. calls, I think obviously, I mean, the thing I'm working on, the Lightning Network, the reason that the reason that I've been doing this for 7 years now is because it takes something that is basically a commodity that has these theoretical properties and it makes them real. The ability to spend things quickly and rapidly, and to get that into end users' hands, and of course scalable, but also just all the things that we want from Bitcoin. Back in the early beginning of Bitcoin, when you heard about Bitcoin, it was like, Bitcoin, it's, you can send it around the world instantly and free. And then you discovered, okay, well, instantly, actually it's got this 10 to 60 minute settlement and everything else. And free is like asterisk. It's currently subsidized and it's not going to be free in future, right? So Joseph Poon, after he did the Lightning Network, made this hat say "Make Bitcoin Great Again," and it was funny at the time because Trump was a joke, but it turned out that was not a joke, but we didn't know, so it was funny. I have one of those hats, but it was funny because it was absolutely like that, because when you first heard about Bitcoin in 2011 or whatever, that was oh great, those things, and then you discovered actually, well, no, there are these caveats, and Lightning brings it back, right? The ability to sort of fairly instantly pay someone and do the whole tap your phone or scan and pay someone in a peer-to-peer cash system is just, it's amazing.
It's impressive, yeah.
And I think it's going to change the world in ways we can't anticipate, because the only thing we've got that's similar to that at the moment is credit cards, and credit cards are an asymmetric system and they're a credit system, which means that the actual payment isn't fast. There's a promise of payment, and there's a whole heap of infrastructure to try to make sure those promises are generally kept, although not always. And if you fall in those gaps, you're in trouble. But also, I don't accept credit card payments. But if I run a Lightning node, there's a symmetry here. Anyone who can send can receive. In fact, you probably should. And that drives there's a whole industry that doesn't exist because micropayments are not a thing. Credit card world, micropayment is anything under $10. It's like, no, micropayment is anything under a cent. Like, the tiny payments. I gave a donation to the human trafficking organization because they accept Lightning, and I sent them $6. Yeah. 20,000 sats. Here you go. Is it much of a donation? No, it's a shitty donation, but I can do that every day.
But they might get more donations because of that. It makes it more accessible.
It took me about 7 seconds, right? And so that's just something I wouldn't have done that on a credit card. I wouldn't have given them a $6 donation, right?
There's chargeback issues with credit cards. There's it's not instant.
It would have been way faster, way slower for me to even put the just go through all that dance. And then I'm like, okay, so am I potentially leaking my data here? Like, who's holding their credit card information? Is that going to be it? Yeah. So all those things, like, no, I just paid with Lightning. It was really cool. So I think this is opening a whole new area of this existing thing, which really, when we trace it back, tells us how insightful Satoshi's design was, because I wouldn't have put scripting in there. I would have been like, no, you know what? It's enough that you've got these keys and you can pay and everything, and you can sort something else out. But Satoshi's on record as saying, that if we don't put it in now, we won't get it. So we need this scripting system so we can make this programmable money, even though there was not a clear, obviously, like, for a long time, nobody used that. Everyone uses it to pay, whatever, and they still do. But it enabled all this stuff. And that is one of the problems in engineering, is what things can you cut? Simplicity is much easier than complexity. You can always add complexity later. So I wouldn't have put scripting in. I wouldn't have done it. And that was a mistake, because actually it is an incredibly important key to the whole system. And we've still optimized very much for making payments. Then Taproot takes it back again. Everything starts to look like a normal payment again. It's a level of forethought. It's a level of thinking steps ahead that would have been very unobvious to me in 2008, 2009. And I had some experience in the micropayments. I would not have gone for this level of scriptability built in, because it seems like a boondoggle that no one used. Well, that shows that's, I'm smart enough to follow, but not smart enough to lead in a case like this. So absolutely.
My mind is frequently blown reading things like mastering Bitcoin, and even now starting into mastering Lightning, but especially like some of the engineering choices, so elegant, that were made so early on, and so prescient to then like circumvent a problem that could come up in years to come or decades to come. And even things like, the including of scripting language instead, which probably seemed irrelevant back then, but now has suddenly become something that we're very glad to have. And
absolutely,
it's incredible, really.
Yeah, it allows Bitcoin to really be the best of both worlds, as a store of value and a great payment system. And you never really had that before in the history of money.
I think, and what you're saying just generally about Lightning being, well, to me, the words that I'll put to it is it's probably one of the most impressive parts of Bitcoin. Like, to me, Bitcoin was already impressive enough. Waiting 10 to 60 minutes for a transaction, or if it's with a friend, you just do it instantly because the wallet will say 0 confirmations, but you can spend it anyway. That was already impressive. But my friends and family weren't that impressed. However, they are impressed when you can send them Lightning and it's instantly there, and you can say, like, that's essentially instant settlement. That's now yours, and it was quick as you downloading a wallet app. you've used the custodial node, but we can take that as a next step to set up your own node later on. But like that just makes it so much more accessible to everyone. And it doesn't even have to be face-to-face. You know, you do it over a Zoom meeting where it's like, oh, just go download this app and show me the QR code on the webcam, and I can just scan it and I can send you money that way. And you're right, micropayments, it just opens up this world of like, I didn't even really think that far ahead in terms of what Bitcoin could be. It sort of already had enough utility, but now it's just gone exponential in terms of that utility. So I agree with you. And I think most, I guess, people that aren't into Bitcoin at the moment would see the benefit of that much greater, because it's more accessible, it's easier, it's quicker, and it's something that they've never had before. So it's impressive in that way that we need to have fundamental adoption.
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, Fulmo sent me this Lightning ATM kit that's sitting on my desk in pieces that I'm meant to put together for exactly this reason, right? I mean, QR code turning into money thing is like you literally put it's a tiny little box. You can't see my hands obviously on the podcast, but it's less than a foot high, and it's just this, it has a coin thing in it, and it has like a Raspberry Pi Zero and a little e-ink display. You put the coins in, shows you the QR code, and pays out to you. So that's pretty cool. In fact, one of the reasons I've got is I want to do the BOLT12 flow, so it's all on the box. But this is absolutely something amazing, and I think it is easier to kind of impress people. On the other hand, they've already got credit cards, and they're like, "Oh, but I can do that with a credit card and everything else." And that's when you start to, you can talk about, but the difference is that I'm literally holding the money, and if they're a vendor and they've had chargebacks, they understand that value. But also, I don't care who you are. You paid. I don't care, because I'm actually holding the money. I don't need to know, are you the kind of person, whatever. I've got the money, right? So it is a very, very different from a credit system when you dive underneath, and we haven't had to build this trust infrastructure to try to guarantee that you will eventually pay this. And I think, with this bifurcation, I mean, credit networks require a huge amount of knowledge. They need to know, is this the kind of medication you normally buy? Like that's their job, right? The credit card networks are increasingly looking at optimizing by figuring out more and more and more about you, because
fraud,
because they're trying to prevent fraud, right? It's inevitable that these systems become increasingly surveillant on the people using them, whereas you can bypass the whole thing by literally giving money, and you couldn't do that before, and now you can. And so it really doesn't matter. Just, I've got the sats now. And for some industries, that's incredibly important. And when they understand what we've built here, I think that's going to be a huge driver. Particularly, there are literally industries that can't accept credit cards for this reason. So, because the chargebacks are too high. And perhaps there are industries that don't exist because you couldn't build them prior to this.
That's true. I even think of international remittances, and an example that Alex Gladstein gave, I think it was not the most recent Bitcoin conference in Miami, but the one before. We were saying like American policy says that we should support Cuban entrepreneurs because they're primarily capitalists, so this is going to be a very good thing. But good luck ever finding a US bank that will let you ever send to Cuba, because they're like, this is too much trouble. There's no point doing it for the very few people that would benefit, so we just won't offer that service at all. Bitcoin, all of a sudden you can do that now. Lightning, you can do it even faster than you could before. So beyond like our own kind of internal experience in, say, in Australia or just developing countries working with each other, once you get to that international remittances global market, it just, it's even more mind-blowing in terms of what becomes possible and the kind of industries that we haven't been able to have, or the kind of human and development and growth and societal development and growth that we haven't been able to have because we've had these, or bottlenecks essentially. We've had these delays in processing or chargebacks or intermediaries stepping in the way and saying, well, you haven't given me enough information, or I don't think you should be spending there, or for those reasons, or during these time periods, or on the weekend, or whatever it might be. Like you remove all of that and you say, well, the money can go where it needs to now. Like that's the best free market enabler I think there possibly could be, is having like free money that can go wherever it needs to actually go, where there is demand for it.
Absolutely. Cool. And there's absolutely more infrastructure to be built as well, because it turns out like people are idiots and they send money where they shouldn't. I mean, there's it's like, I got scams. Like, well, okay, sorry for your loss. Now that happens anyway. I mean, all systems work around the availability. We will see that on Bitcoin. So we will see increasingly third-party escrow and stuff like that. Services where, there are cases where, no, literally, I don't want to give you the money for the car yet. We want to have these services, and that is a whole growth opportunity as well. And to some extent you go, well, isn't that reinventing the wheel? It's like, no, because it's not in at the base layer, right? You can still use it raw, but then you have these optional services. And I expect that growth to continue, and we will see new things develop like this. I mean, I like customer protections on my credit card to some extent, but there's definitely a line, and there's definitely cases where like, no, I want the money up front. That's fine as well. So, but and to me, it's obviously important that this will occur in a privacy preserving way. And I think the incentives are now aligned again in a way they're just simply not with credit cards, where I really do want to, because you've just given me a promise to pay, I need to know an awful lot of information to judge whether or not this is real. Whereas if you've actually given me the money, we've sidestepped a whole heap. So yeah, look, there is so much work to be done, and this is a long road ahead of us. But I'm just delighted by the stuff that we've done already, and I can, we can definitely see the path forward. And there's having come back from the Lightning Summit particularly, there's a huge pile of things to do. And as engineers, we always look at problems, but it is important that we realize just what an amazing thing is in front of us.
How far it's come, yeah.
Absolutely.
I just have one final quick question for you, Rusty, before we go. What's your favorite mobile Lightning wallet?
Oh, good question. Actually, Phoenix is actually definitely my favorite. It is non-custodial. They're very involved in the spec process. So I have two on my phone, and that's my backup. I have my remote one that controls my node, which is always running the latest bleeding edge experimental. So it isn't perhaps the most reliable way of paying. And then I have Phoenix, and I use Phoenix as my. I don't actually have. I should have Blockstream Green on my phone, but I don't know. I upgraded my phone. I don't know if I actually installed it because I use
not Lightning, right?
I use Phoenix. No, but I use Phoenix for on-chain payments as well now. Because they charge you a fee to swap out, and
they just like a submarine swap or something like that.
And they charge you a fee to say you're paying this. Fine, you just do it. So absolutely, Phoenix is my go-to. There are others that people prefer, but if I look at who's been in the game the longest and who's done the most work to make mobile work, I would definitely give kudos to them. And I have a huge amount of trust in the way they're pushing forward and everything else. There are other mobile wallets out there, but that is definitely the one that I would trust with my funds.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Is that can you have your own node with Phoenix as well, or is it mainly custodial? Good, that way you get all the sort of swap features and everything.
Phoenix is a node, literally on your phone.
Gotcha.
Right? So it does everything. It just outsources. It by default, you can actually open channels to it as well, but by default, they do zero-conf channels with their big async node.
Gotcha.
And so they'll pay for it. So if someone sends you a payment and you haven't got sufficient capacity, they'll open one and it'll be there going, cool, yep, it'll show you in the GUI, but it's still kind of pending coming through and stuff. But it is pretty painless to use. They do enough of the assistance for you to make the experience much better.
And more
but
streamlined.
It's all yours.
That's really good. I use Zeus at the moment, which is much more kind of manual in terms of setting up channels and managing channels, etc. Which for me, it's just like a payment one, which makes it much easier in that regard. But I'll have to check out Phoenix too, because that sounds like it's got kind of more under the hood, but at the same time in a sort of more streamlined process where I don't have to manage quite as much manually. So very cool. We're more or less out of time. So thank you so much for your time. Having said that, I'll give you a chance to do final thoughts if you feel like there's some final thoughts there. Don't worry about your social media stuff. I'll chuck them in the notes and what we talked about earlier in terms of maybe some documentation if people want to get involved in Core Lightning to just like run it, experiment it, provide some feedback. I'll pick your brain afterwards and chuck that in the show notes. But yeah, anything final that you wanted to finish up on?
No, I think we covered a huge amount here. I think, hopefully excitement about Lightning came through. I think it's something you should definitely be looking into if you're in the Bitcoin space, because I think it's exciting. And we're seeing a huge amount of growth at the moment. People are discovering it and going on and everything's kind of snowballing right now, which is amazing to see. So, onwards.
It's an exciting time to be in the space. And again, I think with the way you captured it just before was really good. Is just need to recognize where we've come, what we've accomplished, what we've got available now, but the challenges ahead and keep working basically.
Yeah, thank you, Rusty. That was I learned a lot in this discussion and I found it very useful. So
absolutely.
Thanks for your time for coming on with us.
Indeed. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone for listening. And until next time.